In this very in-depth forecast, two main regions for storm development are currently being monitored, where in the north across western Kansas into southern Nebraska, clustered storms and potentially isolated supercells could harbor the potential for multiple tornadoes, some of which could be strong, massive hailstones upwards of 3 inches, and damaging wind gusts upwards of 70 miles per hour. In the south across Texas and Oklahoma, a line of severe thunderstorms could harbor the potential for a couple of tornadoes, massive hailstones upwards of 3 inches, and damaging wind gusts upwards of 70 miles per hour. Everything you need to know on Project Gladiator. Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for April 25th of 2024. For today we have a dual enhanced risk setup, one enhanced risk for eastern Kansas into southern Nebraska into portions of far eastern Colorado, as well as an enhanced risk for southern into central Oklahoma and northern into northwestern Texas there. Risks for today do include a 10% tornado risk with the possibility of strong tornadoes across the enhanced risk region. We could definitely see the possibility of multiple tornadoes as well. There is definitely tornado outbreak potential with that 10% tornado risk, and we will go over that. And then we also do have a 5% tornado risk that extends down across the rest of the slight risk region, including the southern enhanced risk area, where we could see the potential for not necessarily strong tornadoes, but definitely could see the potential for a couple of tornadoes with some of those storms down there. For our damaging wind risk, we do have a 30% for our enhanced risk region to the south, as well as a 15% for the enhanced risk region to the north. For our damaging hail risk, we do have a 30% for the enhanced risk region in the north and the south, with the hash area indicating that we could see the potential for some massive hailstones. For tomorrow, we have an enhanced risk for Iowa into northern Missouri, northeastern Kansas, and eastern Nebraska there. Risks for tomorrow do include a 10% tornado risk with a 5% that extends all the way down into eastern, northeastern Texas there, where we could see the potential for a strong tornado or two, and potentially a few tornadoes as well. And then for our wind risk, we do have a 15% for the slight risk region, where we could see the potential for some scattered damaging wind gusts, as well as a 30% hail risk, where we are watching for the potential of some massive hailstones that could potentially extend all the way down into northeastern Texas there. For our day 3 outlook, we have a 30% or an enhanced risk for the central plains for Kansas, Oklahoma, into northern Texas, as well as into Missouri there. We do have a probabilistic 30%. We are definitely watching this closely. A couple models did go absolutely ballistic for this risk, and there is definitely a lot of concern when it comes to this risk. This is for Saturday, so if you do live in this affected area, this could definitely be the most concerning risk out of all three that we've looked at so far. So if you do live in the affected area, please definitely make sure you are watching for updates on this. Taking a look at our day 4, day 8 outlook. For our day 4 outlook, we do have a 15% for a lot of the Mississippi River Valley region in the Midwest that extends all the way down into the Central Plains in northeastern Texas there, where we could be watching for the potential of some significant severe thunderstorms that could be upcoming. And that's about it for our day 4 to day 8 outlook. For our WPC outlooks, starting off their excessive rainfall forecast for today, we do have a slight risk that extends across the Central Plains for southern Nebraska, north or central and eastern Kansas, northeastern Oklahoma there, as well as northern Arkansas into portions of western Missouri there, where we could be watching for the potential of some scattered flash flooding. For tomorrow, we do have a slight risk that extends across southern Missouri, Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma, and northeastern Texas, where we could be watching for the potential of some scattered flash flooding. And then for day 3 outlook, we do have a moderate risk for flash flooding, where we could see the potential of some widespread flash flooding, including the potential for some significant flash flooding as well for portions of across central and eastern Oklahoma, as well as a slight risk that extends into southern Iowa and north central Texas, where we could be watching for the potential of some scattered flash flooding. For our winter weather outlooks for today, we aren't really watching for anywhere across more flatter regions, but we could definitely see the potential of some isolated heavy snowfall for portions of the elevated Rockies there. Same with tomorrow and our day 3 outlook, where we are going to be seeing the potential for some heavy snowfall across some more elevated portions of the Rockies. Taking a look at our weather model, starting off with our 500 millibars and our surface observations, how those are going to work in conjunction with our risk for severe thunderstorms for today. Across the northern enhanced risk region, which we will start off with, we are expected to see a pretty powerful shortwave trough here that is negatively tilted, advecting out of the south-southwest. and that is supporting the risk for severe thunderstorms, not only in the north but also in the south as well. We do have a surface low that is off to the northeast here from the main upper level low, and that is what's going to drape a dry line down across western Oklahoma, in the Oklahoma Panhandle, western Texas, and that could be able to fire off the potential for some more discrete development down across eastern Kansas into the Oklahoma Panhandle region, and that is going to be what's going to fire off that other round of severe thunderstorms for the enhanced risk region. But we are expected to see a little bit of a dry line bulge push off to the northeast here of our surface low, as well as a warm front that's going to be just ahead of it. And we could see the potential for some supercellular development that is going to be mostly in clusters between the two, and that will allow for a very short window where we could see the potential for some strong tornadoes. And this is definitely a really powerful trough, and we definitely have a lot of spreading of our wind vectors and isobars aloft, especially at our 500 millibars. So that will definitely be a massive aid in our risk for severe thunderstorms for today. But we could definitely see the risk for some massive hail with this, with a 500 millibar flow that could be able to get upwards of 50 to 60 to potentially 70 miles per hour in some region. The main jet streak is upwards of 70 miles per hour, which may advect into this region, but it will be mainly off to the west here. But we could still definitely see some pretty decent speed shear across this region. Taking a look at our 850 millibar winds in our low-level jet and how that's going to affect our directional shear for our tornado risk for today, we are expected to see a pretty powerful low-level jet that is going to strengthen over the next couple of hours. It will likely get to its maximum around the very early morning of tomorrow, and around midnight. It is going to continue to strengthen gradually from here on out. As of right now, it is upwards of 20 miles per hour to 30 miles per hour, which is overall not too strong. But as storms actually slowly develop, and we do have a couple storms ongoing, these are kind of the predecessors to what's about to come next. But with our low-level jet, that could potentially increase to around 40 to potentially 50 miles per hour across this region. That will definitely support the potential for some pretty strong directional shear across this region, and will definitely be supportive of the potential for tornadoes, some of which could definitely be strong across that region. And then further down to the south, where we do have the 5% tornado risk, where storms are expected to develop later on in the afternoon, we aren't really expected to see very strong kinematics, but we are definitely expected to see some pretty wild directional shear with a low-level jet out of the south-southwest here, upwards of 60 miles per hour, which will provide this region with some wild directional shear and could definitely be supportive of the potential of tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our 200 millibars and how that's going to affect our speed shear across this region and the risk for hail, as well as how our spreading of our wind vectors is going to help with our overall storm risk across this region. Let's start off with that because it is already very apparent. If we follow our wind vectors here, you can see that there is a very large amount of defluence. What I drew kind of exaggerates it a little bit, but if we follow our wind vectors closely, it's not far off from what I just drew. There is an insane amount of defluence aloft, and that will provide this region with a insane amount of lift, and that will definitely be very aiding in our risk for severe thunderstorms across this region, especially in the hot spot around the eastern or western Kansas region. And then as far as our speed shear goes, we are definitely expected to see some pretty strong speed shear across this region, with a 200 millibar jet upwards of 80 to potentially 70 miles per hour across this region. It may even cut out a little bit towards the end here after storms actually move out of the region, where we do have a area that may be a little bit weaker as it veers off further off to the west there, but we should still definitely see a very large amount of speed shear, especially for the south there, where we are expected to see the full force of that 200 millibar jet upwards of 90 and 80 knots across this region. Is definitely going to be very supportive of some pretty strong speed shear across this region, and very supportive of a hail risk. Taking a look at our storm relative helicity and our directional shear and how that's going to support our tornado risk across this region. Starting off with the 10% tornado risk with the possibility of strong tornadoes, we are expected to see some really strong directional shear across this region, with directional shear storm relative helicity values upwards of 600 to 800 meters squared a second squared of storm relative helicity across this region. And as the night goes on and that low-level jet strengthens, we are expected to see a very large amount of storm relative helicity felicity along the dry line region there, upwards of 600 to potentially 700 meters squared a second squared of storm relative felicity across the dry line there. So if a storm were to somehow squeak its way out past the cap, it will definitely be in a very prime environment for the potential for tornadoes across this region. Any supercell that could potentially develop, if it's surface based, definitely has a really good potential to become tornadic. And then further down to the south, where we are expected to see overall a lower end risk for tornadoes, even though we are expected to see a really strong low level jet, it may be more in line with our upper level flow aloft at our 500 millibars and our 200 millibars, where we don't really see as much directional shear, upwards of 200 to 300, but it still will definitely be supportive of the potential for maybe a couple of tornadoes across this region with some of these storms. But we could definitely see a much larger tornado potential further up to the north. Taking a look at our bulk shear and how that's going to support our hail risk across this region, the only reason that we don't have a 30% connecting this entire area, despite there being some pretty strong directional shear, is the lack of confidence that storms are actually going to fire in this region. We could definitely see the potential for a storm to squeak out, and that could definitely still support the potential for some massive hailstones, as well as that tornado potential, as I was talking about earlier. But along the warm front region, along the warm frontal region, we are expected to see bulk shear values that could potentially get upwards of 70 to 80 knots and 60 knots. Further down to the south along the dry line, upwards of 40 to 50 knots, and potentially even getting upwards of 60 knots of bulk shear across this region. And then when storms fire down in this southern enhanced risk region, we could see bulk shear values upwards of 50 to 60 knots backing our storms, which will definitely be supportive of the potential for some massive hailstones across this region. Again, upwards of 3 inches is definitely possible. Taking a look at our composite reflectivity as well as our timing, we'll also do some general radar analysis. Starting off with our timing, we do have 2 cells that are currently ongoing, that are currently severe thunderstorm warned, and we are expected to continue to see upscale growth from here, with a cluster of cells that may be able to fire around 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Subtract an hour off of that, that's going to be around 5 p.m. To 4 p.m. And then we could definitely see more of a cluster of storms. It may not really be too isolated. It's definitely going to be pretty clusterful, but that will definitely still be supportive of the potential for tornadoes. We will likely get a train of updrafts in any of these clustered storms further down to the south, with our precipitation venting off to the northeast there. And any of these updrafts on the southern side of our precipitation core could definitely support the potential for tornadoes. The NWS in Wichita was indicating that we could see the potential of potentially violent tornadoes across this region. That is definitely not out of the question, and you will see why, because the environment is going to be absolutely insane. The only reason that I think this tornado risk isn't higher, up to a 15% tornado risk, is probably due to the fact that there is a little bit of uncertainty with if our storms are going to be surface based or not, and how long they're going to be surface based, because we are definitely expected to see these storms fire on later off in the afternoon, and they're going to have a very short window where they can produce the potential for strong tornadoes, and it may not be long enough to really need a 15% tornado risk. Plus, our coverage of our storms may be a little bit more limited further up to the north there, and as far as our general radar analysis, we could definitely see the potential for some supercells that could definitely squeak off in our capped environment along the dry line there. I do know that the ARRR and some other models, we're definitely trending towards that solution, with a supercell or two that may fire off towards southern southwestern Kansas into the Oklahoma panhandle there, and that could definitely be very prime for tornadic development. And then as far as our enhanced risk further down to the south, we could see storms likely develop around midnight to 11 p.m. and those will quickly move into the enhanced risk region, develop into more of an MCS-like feature around 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. and then move into Oklahoma and stay in northern Texas, mainly impacting the Red River region around 4 p.m. with some storms that could definitely extend all the way up into the Oklahoma City region and maybe even all the way into Kansas. Taking a look at our dew points and how that's going to affect our instability and our risk for severe thunderstorms across this region, we are expected to see an insane amount of instability across this region from some pretty decent moisture. We will look at our temperatures, but as far as our moisture goes, we are definitely expected to see some pretty moderate moisture values upwards of the mid to low 60s and the upper 50s, which could potentially increase to around the low 60s more widespread across this region. And we are expected to see a pretty strong dry line here, with our storms that are going to fire off further down to the south in environment in the warm sector, with dew points that could potentially get upwards of 60, the low 60. Across this region, dew points in the low 60, and then we could potentially see a impulse of dew points upwards of the upper 60s, maybe even reaching the low 70s in some region, and that will definitely support some pretty strong amounts of instability across this region, even with it being more so at night. Taking a look at our temperature values and how that's going to affect our instability, let's start off with a warm frontal region where some of our storms are expected to fire off of in the northern enhanced risk region. We are expected to see some pretty warm temperatures upwards of the mid to low 80s across this region, just to the south of the warm front. However, as storms develop, they will definitely have a couple of hours to produce the potential for tornadoes. However, as they move past the warm front into an environment that doesn't have as much heat and into the lack of surface-based instability to the north of the warm front, they will likely lose any chance of them being surface-based and overall lower that tornado potential to basically zero. So we will definitely have to watch that, but that's kind of why we have the majority of uncertainty, is that window of time that our storms are actually going to be able to produce the potential of tornadoes. It could definitely be long enough to potentially support a violent tornado or two, maybe not two, but potentially a violent tornado and potentially one or two strong tornadoes across this region. But further down to the south, we are expected to see our storms fire off very late in the afternoon, where temperatures are going to be lower, but still pretty warm, with them potentially getting upwards of the low 70s, which will definitely support some pretty decent instability across this region. Taking a look at our lapse rates and how that's going to affect our instability as well as our hail risk across this region, we are expected to see some pretty strong lapse rates where storms are going to fire in the northern enhanced risk region, with lapse rates that could potentially range anywhere from the upper 8s to maybe a low 9, which will definitely be a really large aid in instability across this region, and will definitely skyrocket our instability values, especially with how much moisture we have and how much heat we have. We could definitely see a very large amount of instability come out of that, and that will definitely be very big aid to our hail risk as well. And then further down to the south, we are expected to see some pretty strong lapse rates as well, where we could see a low 9 in some upper 8s, which will definitely be a very large aid in instability across this region. It will definitely be needed for instability to keep those storms going if they want to make it all the way to the Oklahoma City region, because of the fact that they will occur very late in the afternoon and the very early morning of tomorrow. Taking a look at our 700 millibar temperatures as well as our convective inhibition, how that's going to affect our overall risk for severe thunderstorms across this region. As of right now, our storms are currently ongoing across the northern enhanced risk region. However, we do have the lack of a cap to actually allow for those storms to fire, which is more of a duh thing. But as the sun sets, we are expected to see that cap be introduced rather quickly, and as soon as our storms move out of the warm frontal region, they will lose all ability to be surface based, and will have a very short window to support the potential of strong tornadoes and potentially tornadoes in general. As they move into the warm frontal region, there won't be as much of a cap in place, as it will be out of the area of warm air advection at 700 millibars, but they could still produce the potential for some large hailstones and potentially some damaging wind gusts, but probably not really all that much of a tornado risk. That tornado risk will definitely be much more limited to the northeastern eastern Nebraska region, and especially if we can get supercells to fire across southeastern Nebraska, or southwestern Nebraska, in northwestern Nebraska, southwestern Nebraska, and the Oklahoma Panhandle. And further down to the south, because our storms are expected to fire so late at night, we are expected to see constant warmer advection and the lack of surface heating, which is going to lead to an insane amount of convective inhibition across this region, even in despite of our storms actually firing, which I do have confidence that they may not fire at all, especially with this cap that's in place. But it does look like our dry line may keep it broken, especially just along that region. But after they do fire, they may rapidly break that cap down around them and may be able to continue all the way into the Oklahoma City region. But we will have to watch to see how this cap affects our storms in the very early morning of tonight and tomorrow. Taking a look at our most unstable cape and how that's going to fuel the risk for severe thunderstorms across the northern enhanced risk region, we are expected to see some pretty strong most unstable cape values, upwards of 2,000 across the warm front region, and we may be able to see some cape values upwards of 3,000 in some small pockets down along the dry line, where we could see the potential of maybe one or two supercells firing up along that dry line, and that will definitely be able to fuel the risk for not only strong tornadoes but also the potential for some massive hailstones and the potential for damaging wind gusts. While further down to the south, we will still see some pretty strong instability even in despite of that cap, with cape values that could be getting upwards of the upper 50s, upper 2000s, the mid 2000s, and potentially reaching small pockets of 3,000, which will definitely be sufficient to fuel the risk for severe thunderstorms, including the potential of maybe one or two brief tornadoes, maybe a couple tornadoes across this region. It all depends on how our cap affects our storms, as well as the potential for some massive hailstones and the potential for some damaging wind gusts. Taking a look at our surface-based cape, I don't really have too much to say about this, other than the fact that our storms are expected to be surface-based because of the fact that we do have surface-based instability across this region. The majority of our most unstable cape does translate down to our surface-based cape, and you can also see that clear boundary where immediately when storms move into, they will not be surface-based anymore, and you can see how slim the window is for the potential of tornadoes and potentially strong tornadoes as well, because the second they move past this warm front further off into northern central, northeastern or northwestern Kansas into southern Nebraska, they will likely be elevated and not really be able to support the risk for tornadoes because there will not be enough surface-based instability and they will be elevated. Same for further down to the south. Even in despite of a cap being in place, we will still see some pretty strong a pretty strong surface-based cape, which will allow for surface-based storms. Even in place of the cap, I'm honestly kind of concerned on how our cap may affect our storms, and I will definitely watch that closely, depending on if I'm still up when our storms actually fire, if I haven't gone to bed already. But in an environment where we do have some pretty decent directional shear, we could still see the potential for a couple of tornadoes with some of these storms. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer instability and how that's going to affect our risk for tornadoes across this region and how that's going to aid in our overall risk for severe thunderstorms, we are expected to see a pool of some fairly lower end 0 to 3 kilometer instability, which may be a little bit of aid to our risk for severe thunderstorms across this region and tornadoes. Same for further down to the south, we are expected to see a pool of 0 to 3 kilometer instability that is going to travel with our storms along that dry line there, and that could definitely be a massive aid in our severe thunderstorms and fueling them. Taking a look at our energy helicity index values and how that's going to indicate our tornado risk across the northern enhanced risk region, and then we'll look at our tornado risk for further down to the south. We are expected to see the potential for potentially strong tornadoes by the time our storms do move out of the region and become more elevated. We are expected to see some pretty strong energy helicity index values that could be able to get upwards of 5, which is definitely a very vile environment and very supportive of the potential of tornadoes across this region. I definitely don't think a violent tornado is out of the question. And we could definitely see the potential for strong tornadoes, maybe a couple of them. It all depends on that window for our storms. And then we may even be able to get another round going with that second round. That may be possible, and that will still be in a very vile environment. It may be a little bit off to the north there because you can see our updraft helicity slowly coming into place, but it is mostly to the north of the boundary where the majority of our energy helicity index values are indicating the potential for tornadoes, and they are very strong. So they may be able to tap into this environment, but they may be a little bit off, maybe a little bit too far to the north there, but this is still a very violent environment and could definitely support the potential of strong tornadoes. It really all depends on that window of timing. And then further down to the south, as I was previously mentioning, we are going to see a very violent environment for the potential of tornadoes along the dry line. If we can get a tornado to squeak out of it, then we could definitely see that potentially become a tornado factory, because this will be in a very vile environment. And then further down to the south, where we could see the potential of a couple tornadoes that won't necessarily be strong, we do have some lower end energy helicity index values that are more in line with the 5% tornado risk, and indicating the potential for a couple tornadoes across this region amongst a weaker shear. Taking a look at our significant tornado parameter and how that will indicate the potential for potentially significant tornadoes across this region. With those first couple storms, as I was mentioning, we do have some pretty decent SIGTOR parameter values that are definitely a little bit more on the lower end, but still indicating the potential for a overall low end risk for potentially significant tornadoes. But later on, where we do have that increase of our low level jet, that is going to be pretty substantial. We are expected to see an increase in our SIGTOR parameter values that does indicate the overall risk of tornadoes being increased, but it does all depend on how far north our storms are going to be, and if they will even fire at all after that second round, because the environment will need to recover. And if they're too far north, then they will probably be elevated. So it really all depends on a multitude of factors. But if they can tap into this very violent environment, they could definitely still produce the potential for a significant tornado. Further down to the south, with our other round of severe thunderstorms, we definitely have some pretty strong SIGTOR parameter values here. For the first couple of hours that storms track through mainly Texas, we do have a hole in our SIGTOR parameter values that don't really indicate that much of a SIGTOR risk. However, as they do move into Kansas, our storms are still ongoing. As they move into Kansas, it will be very late at night, and there will be a lot of convective inhibition across this region, but it still may be able to support the potential for tornadoes. It seems kind of unlikely, but I definitely do think a SIGTOR is definitely not out of the question for down here. We could definitely maybe see a significant tornado for this 5% tornado risk further down to the south here. I definitely don't think that's out of the question. Taking a look at our wind gust models and how that will indicate the risk for damaging wind gusts across this region. With our storms that we are expected to see across the northwestern Kansas region, we could see the potential of some pretty strong damaging wind gusts that may be able to get upwards of 50 to potentially 70 miles per hour across this region. Even outside of storms, we could still see some pretty strong damaging wind gusts, as we will have a really strong low-level jet out of the southwest, and that will translate down to the surface and be pretty gusty, and could definitely blow around some loose unsecured objects and could potentially be damaging depending on how strong our wind gusts get. Further down to the south, though, with that 30% tornado or 30% wind risk, with the potential of not really significant damaging wind gusts, we could see the potential of some widespread damaging wind gusts with these storms that could definitely get upwards of 60 to potentially 70 miles per hour across this region. So we could definitely see the potential of some pretty strong damaging wind gusts. I'm surprised this isn't hatched. Taking a look at our meso-analysis page so we can look at our hail parameters, starting off with our large hail parameter. For both regions where we are expected to see the potential for large hail, not really too far down to the south because that risk is still many hours out, but for the warm frontal region where we do have some storms ongoing, we do have upwards of 28, which is very indicative of the potential for some massive hailstones across this region, and also is indicating an almost certain risk for the potential of some very large hail. And then further down to the south, again, it's not really time for our hail risk just yet, and along the dry line there, we have some really large hail parameter values. So if we can get a supercell to squeak out of the dry line along this region in the Texas Panhandle into southwestern Kansas, they will definitely be an environment where they can produce the potential of some massive hailstones. And then for our significant hail, off to the north there does indicate the potential for some significant hail for that cell in particular, as well as along the Oklahoma Panhandle into southwestern Kansas. And it just isn't time for our risk for hail across the Texas region just yet, so we still have nothing to show. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. If you live in any of the areas I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being. If you notice anything might have been wrong with this forecast, or you would like to make a suggestion or ask a question, please leave a comment. 3 other channels I highly suggest you check out are One Nation Weather Watcher, and JaxonWX. The links to the channels will be in the description, and hopefully I'll be able to see you guys on the live stream.